pleasure to be here tonight, and I want to thank Dr. John Haas especially for setting up such a great place. It's really charmed me tremendously. It's beautiful, and it's a great spirit to be in, and I'm very honored to be invited to come here and speak tonight. And I also want to thank you all for coming and sharing this subject we're going to talk about tonight. I am especially delighted also to be back in the U.S. I have lived for 14 years in Minnesota. I'm married to Deborah, who is from Minnesota. I found her in Norway. Then we lived there for a couple of years. We moved to Minnesota and stayed there for 14 years. But since I'm Danish, I began to miss my home. I was beginning to lose my Danish identity. So we thought we should move back and try to live there for a while. So we did that in 2002. And then slowly I began to miss my American identity because I was formed a Catholic in the American nation. So becoming a Catholic has been a great blessing for me and very associated with being in this country. So it's nice to be back now and share some of my experiences with you and see where this will take me if we're going to actually move back here. We don't have that much Catholic church in Denmark. It's very low profile, very small, and nothing compared to what I experience here. So, I mean, they need some help over there, and I'll do what I can when I'm there, but I need to get a feel too. And especially nice tonight to be listened to. I listen a lot to people all day long, so I enjoy talking. Now it's my turn to speak and for you to listen. And tonight we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is called psychology and faith. Are they incompatible, or can they work together? And then how can they do that without psychology becoming a manipulative, secret faith formation program, and without faith making secular biased compromises? Often the two disciplines, they warn against each other. We have many Christian people say, don't go to the psychologist because you could lose your faith. They can tell you maybe you don't need the faith. And from psychological hold, we sometimes hear being said to people, don't mess with church and all that stuff. Don't seek out that. You could begin to feel guilty about your life and get depressed and feel very bad. So there is this tension, not all the time, but I've certainly met it many times. I say, why not work together? Because they both have similar agendas. They focus on questions such as, what is a human person? How come he made such a mess for himself? And how does he get out of that mess again? That's the subject for psychology and our faith. So I like to consider the different approaches to the same subject an awesome opportunity for a joint venture. This evening is also about one of my big psychological problems ever that bothered me for many years. And now, of course, when I say it, people begin to, wow, will he tell us what it was? Will he disclose some personal information? I'll tell you what it was. It was not pornography. It was not OCD or depression or eating disorder. It was a psychological problem in the very literal sense of the word. I had a great problem with psychology. I've now been practicing psychology for more than 35 years, and there's three mysteries to that. How come I at all got involved in this task of listening to pain and misery all day long, day in and day out? 2, how come I stayed with it for so long? And 3, how come I actually intend to go on with it? You can consider my talk tonight as an attempt to try to answer these 3 questions. Let's begin with number 1. When I turned 16, I became aware of what my heart truly desired. I wanted to become happy. And I knew I was not. And I thought, then what's this point about life if you're not happy? I felt very insecure, actually real stupid and dumb inside, which I, for the most part, managed to hide. I got the idea that the way to go was to become a wise person, to know myself and others in depth, so I could figure out how to live my life and deal with other people who seemed difficult and unpredictable to be around, especially for such an insecure person as myself. I thought if I knew myself, if I knew how I ticked, if I knew how other people ticked, I could plan and figure out how I should behave, what to do and when to do it. Then I would be happy. I could help other people become happy. Then they would like me, and then I would be even more happy. My parents, they were very good Lutheran Christians, and they tried for many years to tell me, Peter, just believe in Jesus. Then you'll be saved and you'll be happy. But that was certainly not sophisticated enough for me. I was not that naive. Any guru could come and tell me to believe in him. So I had the idea that my intellect needed more sophisticated stuff to work with, so I walked off to the University of Copenhagen to study psychology, expecting there to find the golden wisdom and answers to the big questions about life. Talk about being naive. For 7 years, I learned a lot about rats and mazes, how you can learn to remember stuff by repeating it over and over again, many different theories of personalities, how optical illusions work, how to conduct experiments, etc. All sort of interesting, but also a lot of it so self-evident. There was no big revelations for me. Nothing about what it means to be a human person, nothing about how to live life so you can become happy. So 7 years later, with my diploma in my hand, I felt more confused than ever about what it means to be a human person and what psychology actually can do, and how to help myself and people in pain. The only advantage I got from this diploma back then was that many people now thought that I was cool and a wise person on human affairs. Welcome. But I was not very wise, and I knew it. I felt really bothered by a little poem by a Danish author that's called Piet Hein. I don't know if anybody has heard of him. He was excellent in writing little truthful statements, put it on poetry, and with a little jab and edge to it, or deep wisdom to it. For example, he wrote about love. Remember to love while you dare it. Remember to live while you do it. All in Danish, it rhymes much more perfectly than here. But about psychologists, he wrote this. I tried to translate it so it rhymes, because it goes something like this. A psychologist is someone who, by studying hard and steady, has learned all that the rest of us know already. It bothered me, because 27-year-olds, I began an internship in an outpatient child care clinic, and I was scared to death of my first client. I'll never forget it. For the lady much older than me, in her late 30s, I think, and she had been married and divorced twice, and she had 3 behaviorally disturbed kids, and she came to me and asked for help. I had not tried any of all that. So she spoke for an hour. I said nothing. I was simply paralyzed inside. All I could think about was my fear that all of a sudden she would stop, look at me and look right through me and say, "Hey, you psycho puppy, who do you think you are? What do you think you can tell me?" You know what happened? She never discovered a peep of what was going on in me. She kept on talking, very, very consumed with her own troubles, and went on unloading and unburdening, and looked relieved at the end, and thanked me many times for the help I had given her. I think, I made it there, but I think this won't work. I need to get some more knowledge, some more wisdom. I didn't get it in psychology, so I started taking a lot of extra training in alternative approaches, holistic medicine, Eastern spiritual traditions. I wanted to be happy no matter what it took. I did diets, macrobiotics, massages, acupuncture, meditations, astrology, colon cleansing. That's the best one. You name it, I probably tried it. I discovered that through all this, though, that psychological issues often seem to be associated with an imbalance in a person's physiology due to his lifestyle, diet, exercise, sleep, rest, etc. I began to discover an intimate connection between mind and body and how limited psychology was in treating psychological issues if it did not include the physical health dimension. For example, depression and anxiety can be caused by an overconsumption of sugar and caffeine. And if you don't take that into account, then after you can help people get relief from a long counseling session. If they go home and fill themselves on sugar and caffeine, they're right back in a blood sugar drop a few hours later and down the pit again. So if you take that into account, you can see in some cases that people can be helped to get out of depression in 1 to 2 weeks if they do certain things with their diet and exercise. You may have to give some psychotherapeutic support on the withdrawals in that process, but that works great and is a great example of how psychology and physiological know-how can work together. I mean, if you work on those two levels at the same time. I began to have much success with that approach. I had many so-called hopeless psychological cases was all of a sudden not so hopeless as it appeared. They just seemed to be because an important aspect, the physiological dimension, had been overlooked. But through all this, something very interesting happened to me. I had cleaned up my diet, etc., and I started feeling much better, and I could think clear, and I thought I had found the key to happiness. Just a little more massage, a little more acupuncture, a little more this and that, and a bit more colon cleansing, and I would just be enlightened, okay? But that new clarity of mind revealed something unexpected to me, a spiritual void inside. A void that Eastern spirituality could not fill with its impersonal concept of God and its failure to give an account of suffering that made sense to me. This came as a great surprise to me, and it was quite scary because I thought I had just made it, found the key to happiness, and all of a sudden I realized it did not work all the way. That's a drop from a high point. I sensed a great depression around the corner then. But I understood there's more to happiness than just mental emotional well-being, and I was on my search again. I had to explore yet deeper the spiritual dimension as the third dimension in my approach to people, the mind-body spiritual approach. And I think here lies precisely the challenge for modern secular psychology, to acknowledge the reality of the spiritual dimension of the human person and what to make of it. It sounds like an impossible task for a science that wants so badly to be scientific. And I think psychology has largely tried to ignore this dilemma by overemphasizing its focus on its own field, the psychological dimension, the mind. And trying to dig the mind can keep you busy for a long time, as long as you wish. The number of psychologists and people seeking psychologists has simply exploded the last decades. People read psychological literature like never before and have adopted all kinds of psychological, analytical terms in daily language, such as suppression, rationalization, inhibition, projection. What is it about psychology that intrigues so many people so much? Well, the body of knowledge about the human person in psychology has certainly grown tremendously since I got confused from studying it way back in the 70s. Psychology of today has even more so an air of knowledge, maybe even wisdom. I think that psychology has a way of making us believe that through psychological research, we may eventually be able to figure out what we are all about and what life is all about. Well, maybe one will admit we're not quite there yet, but just a little more research, a little more this and that, that's the air around it. And we have the answers to the big questions about how to avoid mental misery and suffering and how to engineer our own everlasting happiness without needing God and religion in the process. And that's, of course, quite irresistible. Many people already cannot make this God program work, the promised wonders anyway. They already feel that God and religion is too biased, too superstitious, too naive, too old-fashioned, too unscientific, too ineffective, and too whatnot. So psychology in a secular version goes well with the growing secular God-resisting, God-neglecting orientation towards life. We want to figure out the important things about ourselves on our own. We want to believe that we're smart enough to take care of ourselves. Sounds familiar? Nothing new. That's how the whole big thing began, with Adam and Eve. They fell for that temptation. We can get by with our own wisdom. We don't need God for that. It's the same temptation today, everywhere. And if we can get by without God, then there's nobody to tell us what to do, and maybe even more important, to tell us what not to do. All the fun stuff, you know. To have someone tell us what not to do feels like a limitation to freedom. It just robs modern man the wrong way. Freedom is to do what you want to do when you want to do it. So I will claim that it makes sense to say that psychology has managed to become a powerful secular alternative to the Christian religion, with psychologists as the new priesthood, offering to help us resolve suffering and become masters of our own destiny. And it would be fine if it worked. The biggest psychological problem of our times is, however, that it doesn't work. Despite great advances within psychology and psychiatry in the development of medication and all kinds of more refined therapeutic techniques, mankind is suffering like never before. John Paul II, which is one of my great heroes, he said, for example, about depression, it's the epidemic of the century. And the number of medical diagnostic categories is exploding for mental illness, sweeping more and more people into the category of mental illness. What's going on? Do we have to invent more sophisticated cures and medications? Well, funny enough, it seems like the more techniques we develop, the more problems we get. Maybe something is wrong with the way we think in this field. Maybe something has been overlooked in this feverish obsession with the belief that we are well on our way to figure it all out. And what has been overlooked is, in my opinion, the simple fact that we cannot solve a problem by focusing on the symptoms of the problem. We must address the root cause. And I actually do not think that anybody will disagree with that, but if we do not know the root cause real well and how to treat it, then it doesn't help much. I have no longer any doubts that most, if not all, psychological problems have roots that reach into the spiritual dimension, which, as I mentioned already, is unfamiliar territory for psychology. If this is true, then of course psychology cannot solve psychological problems satisfactorily without including the spiritual dimension in both theory and methodology. Okay, then what is the spiritual root of all the psychological problems that people bring to the counselor's office? People come to the counselor's office with many different diagnostic categories of personal problems that are troubling them. As a health professional, it's very easy to be overwhelmed by all this multitude of different problem categories. But I don't like to be overwhelmed. I like to simplify things. So I started looking for the common denominator in all these people. And slowly I realized that no matter what my client brings in the door, whether it's a psychotic breakdown, a depression, an eating disorder, an OCD, you name it, they all have two things in common. They are hurting, in pain, and they experience that nobody else fully understands how much they're hurting. They feel alone with it. They are hurting, and they feel alone with it. To me, then, the common denominator found in all mental behavioral dysfunction is a deep experience of aloneness in the sense of isolation. Isolation from what? From communion with others. This is the worst place a person can be, because we know from Genesis it said, it's not good for man to be alone. God speaking here, so it must be significant and very profound. We may think that we understand God's reflection on this when we can say, well, of course, sure, it's kind of boring to be alone. Would be real nice to have some company. No, it's more than that. It's a profound truth about the human person, defining the very core of our identity. In this true core of ourselves, we consequently have a need to be seen and affirmed and loved by others, at least one other. No person is truly independent and self-sufficient, even though that state is held up as an ideal in our culture. It's being preached all the time in secular culture. Be self-sufficient, be independent, and you can't get hurt and all that. We are needy at the core of ourselves, and when this need for love is not met, we fall into the utmost painful experience of abandonment and isolation, if we do not find ways to keep ourselves busy avoiding facing this reality. When a person in this way, in mental pain, feels separated from others, he feels wrong, literally out of place. Something feels wrong with his most personal belonging, his own person. This pain is transmarginal, a concept I have from one of my teachers, Frank Lake, which means it's so deep that the person is unable to tolerate a full realization and experience of the magnitude of this pain without falling totally apart. If we, according to the original plan, are created to be together, then the full consequence of experiencing separation from togetherness is the experience of being on the verge of ceasing to exist. Therefore, the person must develop an escape from this pain, and, ironically, this can be done by creating a mental disorder. OCD, depression, addictions, phobia, etc. Now, these are no fun and cause a lot of misery, sure, but they give a different focus, keeps one busy, being distracted from something much worse, the total loss of identity. Taking on a mental illness diagnosis gives an identity. Better to have a sick identity than no identity at all. It's better to, and more manageable, for example, to have a fear of spiders than fear of annihilation of self. It's better to be depressed and not able to really feel anything than to feel this penetrating dread of being totally alone in cosmos. Better to struggle with an OCD and, for example, wash hands 100 times a day than feel that the very core of my soul is wrong and stained. Can give a little relief, trying to clean something. Better to develop an eating disorder and become obsessed with food and fill your stomach with food you can get than experience the unbearable longing for a love that you did not get when you needed it and still don't know how to get. Now, the development of these conditions are, of course, not conscious to the person suffering them. It's the result of a survival instinct at work at very deep levels of the psyche. You see, in developing or inventing a diagnosable mental disorder, the suffering is traded in for more manageable misery. And when given an identity of illness, the mentally ill now belongs to a community, unfortunately that of sick people, but that is better than to not experience any belonging at all. And finally, being included in the medical system gives the hope that something can be done about all this by the clinical experts, which puts hopelessness on the back burner, at least for a while. And hope, just any kind of hope, for whatever reason, is better than hopelessness. So you see that where we may be inclined to think that people with mental health problems are suffering because they have psychological problems, I believe it's the other way around. They have mental health problems because they are suffering. That is why I do not see mentally ill people as ill, but as people who are suffering in deep pain, a pain that's so deep that they cannot embrace it alone. We all know how good it feels to be understood by someone who can see us and understand and feel our pain. Just one other person is needed to make all the difference in the world. So if all these different mental diseases are defenses against the deep pain of isolation and being unloved, then the root problem of mental dysfunction is the person's inability to embrace this pain that is existing in his or her soul. And this inability should not be seen as a shortcoming or dysfunction in the person's makeup as such. It's due to human nature, due to limited capacity of the human heart to endure and embrace this pain of this intensity alone. The key word is really alone. Here we are at the outer limit of the human condition referred to in the statement, it is not good for man to be alone. Here it really is impossible for man to be alone without going crazy or disintegrating, falling apart, committing suicide, and all this. Facing such shortcomings, we are all alike. We all have this limitation in our makeup. And we will all develop different personal strategies to cover up, avoid, or distract ourselves from whatever we may carry our pain in our baggage. Some strategies are socially acceptable, some are not, and then we attempted to call them illnesses. But the basic problem is the same. This is heavy stuff. I hope I'm not ruining your evening. It will soon get better. Based on this understanding, then, a solution presents itself. We need to find a way to break into the afflicted person's experience of desolate isolation, helping the person not to avoid or numb the pain, but to endure this pain, supported and carried by our presence. True presence is only possible if we can let the pain of the afflicted soul resonate within our own soul. If we succeed in conveying to the other person that somebody, we, can be there with him or her with authentic compassion, which we can also call co-suffering, the spell of isolation can be broken and the pain will change character. Rather than bringing about the experience of aloneness, the pain now becomes the very means through which the experience of a deep and unique communion with another person can take place. And communion is another expression of love. The very nature of love is to bridge the existential gap between persons. Now the pain can be endured, and actually the joy of communion will overrule the suffering. The whole picture changes, and when the pain can be endured, the basic need for the mental behavioral dysfunction that was developed as a defense against the pain is eliminated or at least significantly reduced. There may still be some habits, but we are in much better position to break them. It's simply amazing how much suffering we can endure if we are not alone with it. But this approach requires that we take suffering very seriously and understand that suffering is a normal part of human existence. And our secular culture has a hard time with that. We live in a painophobic culture, in which suffering and pain does not make any sense whatsoever. Only happiness and success is acknowledged as criteria for normalcy and true human values to strive for. Suffering is simply seen as an error. Therefore, our culture chooses to place suffering in the category of sickness. It is seen as an unwanted disease that some people were so unfortunate to catch, and that needs to be treated or numbed out as fast and effectively as possible. Consequently, when we define mental suffering as illness, the case is referred to the medical domain and often treated with medication because that is what you do to illness. Medication may numb the pain, which can be helpful and needed as a temporary intervention, but it does not address the root cause, which in most of the cases I'm thinking about is spiritual, not medical. Now, if the root problem of a mentally suffering person already is that he or she is in a state of feeling deeply isolated from others, defining this person as sick will easily make the root problem worse. Being sick, especially if you're sick in your mind, means being outside the human family of normals that we all want to belong to. People who suffer as mental illness will often experience a sense of loss of dignity. One can accept that I can have an illness in my body, but the idea of being sick in my mind is different. It has an air of being second-class persons, almost modern leprosy, if you will. So mental health diagnosis can have a stigmatizing effect that burdens many people. Despite many initiatives from the mental health establishments to overcome this problem by campaigning that it's normal to be sick, you can never make these people feel totally okay about themselves at the core of their identity. It simply can't be normal to be abnormal. When I relate to these people that I do not see them as ill, but as suffering persons, often, if timing is right, something happens right away. The moment they get my point, it is as if their human dignity is restored, instantly sometimes, often followed by a sigh of relief and renewed hope. I rarely have to try to convince them about this. Typically, they pick it up right away. And I think that's because they hear the truth being spoken. The truth shall set us free, we know. It's like they knew it already, because the truth is written in our hearts, we know. But they needed to hear it from a professional with some authority. They may still have some problems functioning mentally and behaviorally due to long-time habits of dysfunction, but a giant step has been taken. The root cause has been identified and nothing is the same. Their case all of a sudden makes sense. They may still have difficulties, yes, but they can see they're not crazy. This gives new hope, a hope that is not based on well-meaning but empty promises, but on a tangible personal experience. I am not a hopeless case. It's like it's a conviction that's affirmed from within, not just something they hang on to because I, the specialist, told them. Thus, instead of viewing intense human suffering as mental illness, I say that we should see it as part of the entire human condition at this stage of mankind's history. Anybody of us who takes a deep look inside ourselves will discover some pain, or at least some locked doors behind which we can sense there's too much pain stored. We should not feel bad about that. It's part of being a human person, and then we should see if we can do something about it. And that is precisely what our Christian Catholic faith has tried to tell us for 2,000 years and given us solutions for. Therefore, instead of defining mental pain as illness and refer these people primarily to the medical domain, we must see them as suffering, which primarily is a spiritual condition that should be referred to agencies claiming spiritual expertise. In such an agency, if you want to call that, we find in our faith and our church who was our master in suffering, Jesus Christ crucified. And the church's 2,000 years of experience in dealing with suffering people offers a body of wisdom that it would be biased and unscientific for health establishment to ignore. We know that the scientific community has difficulties with the word truth and therefore shies away from what the Christian church has to offer. However, all scientists must operate on the basis of hypotheses and theories that they think are truthful until otherwise proved. As a scientist, I do not mind to claim that I think the Christian worldview is the best theory about the human condition ever offered when it comes to explain where we came from, how we ended up in this mess, and how we get out of it again. At least it makes enough sense to the rational mind to deserve being included as a legitimate theory on the same level as all the other attempts to explain human behavioral dysfunction. And based on that model, the Christian faith has come up with an ingenious program for healing and recovery. However, the challenge is to find a way to transfer this wisdom and the healing power of the faith to the person in need of it. It's not enough to have an intellectual understanding of all the blessings included in the Christian faith. One must also have a personal experience of it in order for grace to work in one's life from within and satisfy the hunger of the soul. The difficulty we encounter in this task is that the modern mind has become so psychologized that it has great difficulties grasping and absorbing the simple but powerful truths of the reality of God's love as it's presented and explained in the gospel. Facing this dilemma, even representatives of the church will themselves often refer deeply suffering and dysfunctional persons to the secular medical establishment because they do not know what to do with them. Unfortunately, thereby downplaying the healing potential the church carries within her own treasure box. We can say the medical authorities lack spiritual insight and competence. The spiritual authorities sometimes lack psychological insight, or in other words, tools to present its treasures in a language and an approach, a methodology, one could say, that can reach the deeper layers of modern man's psyche, where the needs for this healing message of God's unfathomable love abides. So we end up with the gap between faith and daily life. And it's precisely here that I find psychology can be helpful in translating the powerful wisdom and solutions of our faith into a language and a therapeutic methodology that is attuned to the psychological dynamics of the suffering client. However, it has to be a psychology that sees itself in service to the Holy Spirit. And it is in this way that I see that psychology can be a gift to the church. And it is in this spirit that I try to practice psychology. I'll give you a few cases I work with. Something live. There's been enough theoretical talk. Ironically, there's one point, very brief one. Ironically, when we reject suffering and chase happiness, the outcome is that we get more suffering and misery. If you're not allowed to feel bad and find yourself feeling bad anyway, then you may start feeling bad for feeling bad. You see that? I see that so much. If you're depressed in a culture that worships happiness and success, you'll feel a failure and become depressed because you are depressed. So we have a second order depression on top of the first one. I see that a lot. Inspired by Scripture's account of suffering and misery as an inevitable state of the human condition, I've seen a great clinical potential in giving people permission to feel bad. Let's take the first one, call her Sarah. She's a middle-aged married woman with 2 children. She's from Germany, but married a Dane and moved to Denmark, where she had a hard time settling in. Very emotionally deprived childhood. Her mom was a bitter woman, angry with her husband who left her, and she tried suicide because she couldn't handle the kids. She survived the suicide attempt, but died a bitter woman. When Sarah was little, she remembers being at the doctor for minor surgery, and she could not sit still, so he slapped her, an incredible licking. The dentist also had problems with her and treated her harshly. Her parents rejected her, no physical affection, so she decided to reject them too. She felt very alone. As an adult, Sarah is chronically burdened by guilt feelings. Her body is full of aches and pains and tensions, for which she goes to the physical therapist very regularly. So we are dealing with a very sad woman. She cries often, but always hiding it, crying alone. She's ashamed of being so sad because it annoys her husband tremendously. He's a good provider and takes good care of her. They're well off and she has everything materially. So he's often dissatisfied with her for not being more happy. So she gets the message that her sadness, her pain is wrong, and feels sad for being sad. The doctor diagnoses her with depression and immediately recommends antidepressants, which she really doesn't want to take if she can avoid it, and she wants to come and talk to a psychologist first. After a long talk with her, I can see that she, ever since she was a kid, was never allowed to be sad. She was never embraced in sadness, never allowed to pour out her sorrow-filled heart to another. She's nervous about seeing me. She's expecting that I'm another professional that's just going to try to make her happy. And then she'll feel a failure again. Instead, I assure her honestly that it's totally okay to be sad when you're sad. In a way, you can hardly find anything more self-evident if you think about it. But she's never heard that before. So I have to repeat it and get across that I'm very serious about it. There's an immediate sign of relief, and she begins to cry right in front of me. She becomes self-conscious and tries to stop crying. But I keep encouraging her to continue and not quit. I say, just cry. Cry as long as you can. We have piles of time. She goes on sobbing for a while, 20 minutes or so. I'm just sitting there listening, not being impatient, just kind of feeling very happy for her. When her sobbing fades away, I gently suggest, do not stop if there's more. She goes on for another round, 10 more minutes. So this keeps going for about half an hour total. And I don't remember she said it, but many people with this will say, I don't dare even begin because I'll never end. It rarely takes more than half an hour, this never. Then she becomes totally quiet, totally. And you can tell she feels and looks different. Now smiling very warmly, surprised, and a little tired, but excited. Going back to the doctor the next day, he admits that he almost cannot recognize her and is totally surprised to see the change in her. She visits her physical therapist. He's also very surprised to find that all the tensions in the upper arms, in the neck, and her back, they're gone. People at work come over to her and tell her, wow, you look so good. What can we learn from this and many other similar cases? Conclusion, you can never become truly happy if you are not allowed to be truly sad when you are. I have told this to so many sad-looking people, and the immediate response is a big smile. Case 2. A man in his early 40s, we'll call him Paul. He's diagnosed with schizophrenia and on disability pension and goes to some daycare center for mentally disabled. He's had some psychotic episodes in the past when he, during a visit to the medical doctor, all of a sudden attacked him violently. He's now drugged pretty heavily with antipsychotic medication. He comes into my office walking very stiffly and has this apathetic staring look that you often find in people who are on very heavy dosages of antipsychotic drugs. I'm, of course, very curious what I can do for him and why he's coming. So I ask him. He sits down very slowly, and I'm struck by the stiffness in his body and rigidity of his movements. And I'm thinking, this is going to be a hard case. He shares a short poem with me that he has written, and it goes something like this. Again, I couldn't make it rhyme in English, but here's what he said. Cry I cannot, and laugh I cannot either. The minutes slowly drips down hither. He cannot feel anything, and he would like, with my help, to feel his feelings. I asked him to tell me about what it was like to be little Paul in his family when he grew up, and I soon find myself listening to the most heart-wrenching story of a little tender and very sensitive boy growing up in the most emotional, cold, and rigid climate you can imagine, with parents totally out of touch with themselves and the needs of a little boy. It was kind of ice cold. That's the picture you get, emotionally speaking. No touch, no hugs, no loving words. He has a hard time making friends as he grows up. In his teens, he falls in love with a girl, but she rejects him in a very traumatic way, and after that he got quite disturbed and dysfunctional, mentally and behaviorally, and was hospitalized. As I'm listening, I try to connect with what that little boy behind this stiff exterior facade of mental illness, and I see sadness of tremendous dimensions. And all of a sudden, it just blurts out of me, you know what? You're not sick at all, you're just so sad, so sad. This statement hits him physically, almost like an electric shock. He starts shaking and gasps for air in quite a disturbing way and becomes more and more restless in the chair. He moves around in the chair. I sense something is building up, and for a split second I begin to wonder if I triggered another psychotic episode and maybe he's getting ready to attack me. And then he breaks out sobbing. Really like a little boy, just beautiful, clear sobbing. And he buries his face in his hands. And as you probably know by now, I keep encouraging him. Continue, just go, just let it come. Gently, just let it come. It goes on for quite a while, and I wait just patiently and compassionately. I'm happy for him. Something comes alive that's been buried for so long. I'm moved myself. There's probably a little Peter inside me that even if I didn't suffer that much, enough to know that I can imagine how he felt. And after this so-called breakdown, which in my vocabulary is not a breakdown, it's a breakout of stored up pain, he is just elated. He's happy. I can feel my feelings. It was beautiful to see. He comes back many times, and we get in touch with more feelings down the road, and he's very satisfied with that. And then he quits coming. Now, this did not cure his condition. All of a sudden, he wasn't disabled anymore. When people have been on heavy dosages of psychotropic medication for many years, the brain adjusts to these, and it can be hard to wean the brain off again. But still, from this case, we see that it is possible to penetrate the shell of medication and psychological defenses and reach the person's heart and unburden it to some degree. This improves his life quality anyway, because life is lived from the heart. He told me he was now seeing a woman who had some problems with him before because he was so unemotional. He felt more hope now that he would be able to be emotional closer to her. So this simple principle of feeling and embracing one's feelings, especially when they are painful, goes a long way. Even though it hurts, most people affirm that on top of this pain, it feels good to feel what is really there. When we don't want to own this precious, vulnerable part of ourselves, we split ourselves, and that is not a good feeling. We begin to feel estranged and then alien to ourselves when we lose our center. But in allowing the pain to break through, we bring our split parts together and become whole again, or integrated, as I say. Okay, Dr. Peter, this crying sounds good. But what about if the pain is really, really bad? And I'll give you a case on that. That's the last thing I'll share with you before I break. Let me tell you about my meeting with Rick. I'll never forget the way he came into my office, the first client of that day. He walks slowly across the room and heavily drops down in the chair across from me. It's taken him a long time to decide to see a psychologist, but now he's finally done it. To be so indecisive is very unlike this person. He is otherwise a very proactive, independent man, around 40. But what is weighing on him today is a very personal issue that mercilessly cuts through the very core, very bone and marrow of one of our most dreadful and frightening states of mind: helplessness. He's chosen a psychologist whom he knows is open to consider the dimension of faith in his counseling because he's a Christian, or a believer, as he calls it, and he's very active in his church. And to many Christians, it can be embarrassing to go and see a psychologist for help, because that could mean that one admits that the God one otherwise in daily life believes in and counts on seemingly cannot or doesn't want to help one out with this issue. His facial expression is serious and pale. His eyes are a mix of blank and deeply sad, but also bitterness. He has for a long time suffered nightmares. I sense that so far he's tried to cope by distancing himself from reality by frequently uttering ironical remarks. I already know a little bit about this issue from our introductory phone conversation and have no doubt that he's having a hard time. But this morning when he comes in, his inner struggle is just laid out in front of me in a detailed and penetrating way that really did something to me. Rick is married and has a little daughter, 4 years of age. He suffers from serious troubles with lower back and has already gone through 6 surgeries, all extremely painful. When operated on the last time, something goes wrong, an infection spreads in the wound. For a long time, he lies nailed to the bed, discouraged and helpless with serious pains that even pain-killing medication does not seem to do much about. During this time in the hospital, his wife leaves him for another man and takes a little girl with her. He shares this with me in a monotonous tone of voice, slightly ironical, and completely without any sign of being emotional. This is the first time he shares his story in a setting where the focus is entirely on how he truly is feeling about all this. His face gets more and more gray and almost seems petrified. It's as if the capacity to feel anything has been totally shut down, for good reasons. I try to put myself in his place, hoping to experience a compassion that can inspire me to share a word of wisdom or do something that can break through to this isolation he feels in this dark night of his soul. All of a sudden I realize how excruciating and unapproachable his suffering is, and nothing comes to me. I sit empty-handed, empty-minded. What do you tell a person in this situation? It is as if everything I could possibly say or do that would be okay in many other counseling settings would be too simplistic or embarrassingly disrespectful in this setting that I suddenly find myself thrown into. I'm totally left to my own helplessness and working hard on accepting the silence and my growing nagging feeling of being incompetent. I try to get used to all these very difficult emotional states in myself, and again remind myself that it's okay to take the time it takes. It's like something else is going on, something deeper is going on here. That perhaps this crazy situation is not so meaningless as it seems. I can't get a hold of it. While sitting there, I ponder his helplessness in his physical suffering that most of all looks like torture. And I ponder the fact that one of those people closest to him who in his suffering he's most dependent on, how she lets him down in the most vulnerable moment. And then suddenly it hits me that what I could not get a hold of a few moments earlier, the theme of what is going on right in front of me is now crystal clear. I see so many tangible parallels to the suffering of Christ in his passion, especially when nailed to the cross. Right here in front of me is a person crucified with Christ in the experience. It's almost like I'm standing on holy ground. And after the long silence, the words come out of me. It's a crucifixion you are going through. There's a silence, but I can see the statement hits him deeply. There's a trembling in his body. He sits still for quite a while, but you can tell that from a state of being paralyzed with pain, he is now pondering very deeply what I said. His stiffened facial expression softens. It is as if a shadow that was covering him is sliding away and color returns to his face and life to his eyes. I sense there is relief going on in his soul, and then he responds slowly, but with a sincere tone of amazement in his voice. I've never thought of it that way. This discovery in this moment became a turning point in his therapy course with me. 2 weeks later, he remarks that the reference to the crucifixion event right in that moment was a great help. Something significant happened. Something deep inside was touched and nothing was the same. Especially the hope that it's possible to get through this suffering took root in his heart. His mood became lighter. This tangible change seems to hold. 4 weeks later, he shares that he started to feel a slight sense of joy again that seems to come from within. He says, it's really a long time I felt anything like that. He started to scrutinize passages in Scripture that deal with innocent and seemingly meaningless suffering, and is now strengthened in his faith that God never lets you down. His faith has grown. The anger that was all-consuming earlier is receding and does not seem to be so dominant anymore. The disappointment and bitterness is significantly reduced. But the sorrow and the sadness has come more to the foreground, which is a good thing, because these emotions hold a lot more life and warmth in them than bitterness.